Thank you for coming back to your seats. This second roundtable is going to talk about the commitment of Charlotte Perriand, her political engagement. We're going to have Véronique Bergen on my right, Sarah Wilson, and Cynthia Fleury, whom I will introduce very briefly. Véronique Bergen, first. You have published a considerable number of books on very different themes, a very diversified work, philosophy, novel, poetry, theater, entertainment, show around major figures like Sartre. And we're going to talk about Sartre's engagement, Genet, Visconti, Patti Smith, Deleuze, Hélène Cixous. Véronique Bergen works in Brussels, where you occupy a considerable intellectual territory. Yes, let me use that expression. Sarah Wilson, art historian. You teach at the Courtauld Institute of London, but you have a trans-channel experience. You've worked on a number of different themes related to France. You have had a wonderful exhibition in 2002 on Paris, capital of the arts. You have worked a lot on the relationship between politics and architecture after the war. You have written a book about Picasso, Marx, and socialism. This occupies a lot of issues, talks about a number of issues dealt with in the exhibition. You have been innovative in your teaching. You've created a master's degrees with Boris Groys. Boris Groys is also an art historian, culturologist, as the Russians say, a very rich work. And this is, I think, what is more directly related to Charlotte's universe, notably after the war. Finally, Cynthia Fleury, who teaches in 3 different institutions in Paris, in the École des Mines, in the teaching hospital of Sainte-Anne, where you have the philosophy chair, and also at the French CNAM, which means that you are both in the area of politics, philosophy, public health, and the question of imagination. This was the theme of your dissertation, the philosophy of imagination. You have become very interested in care policy and their humanistic dimension. A few years ago, you've proposed a very interesting reading of Charlotte Perriand around the question of the living in Charlotte Perriand's work, and I guess that it is on this very aspect you will be talking today. Just by way of introduction for this session about a committed woman, an engaged woman, a very traditional quotation of Sartre, who in 1948 tried to define literary engagement. He was saying a writer is engaged when he tries to be as lucid as possible and tries to be on board when he commits in a very spontaneous way. That is a quite powerful quotation. What I think is interesting is in this quotation is this notion of onboarding, getting on board. So the question I would like to ask all speakers this morning is the following: on what boat or fleet was Charlotte in the different decades of her life? Maybe Véronique to start off, if you don't mind. Yes, I'd like to answer. I would say that in Charlotte Perriand there's the conjunction of action and dream, freedom in situation, and also dream, utopia. And I was thinking of Rimbaud, who also talked about a ship that may be drowning. I'm just talking about the visionary aspect of Charlotte Perriand in the area of sustainable development. Bernard told us about that. That's very fundamental, because we can see her as a whistleblower. All of the signals she launched in 1935, 1936 were not heard at all. That is my first answer to your question. Sarah? If you want to keep the metaphor of the boat, I think it's a luxury cruise with very small cabins. You have to be very sleek and just bring one suitcase, because it is this sleekness that is wonderful. Let's imagine Maurice Jardot with his toothbrush. That could be the whole expedition. Everything is very simple and bare. This possibility of living in a present that only is versed into the future. That is wonderful with Charlotte Perriand. There are very few mortal people who could have the same aspiration, who do not carry a lot on their back. So I have a lot of esteem for her, notably for her ability to live very barely in a bare environment, and this is going to have an impact. One word on this issue by way of order. I would like to say that swimming was very important for her. She loved the elements, she loved water. It is through the question of the milieu, how the milieu reaches her, that she produced furniture that were holding the milieu together. So, thank you. Maybe Véronique, can you go back to your basic point and leave our metaphor? Yes, I'm going to talk about giant photomontage in the work of Charlotte Perriand. I'm going to start from her conception of art as engaged, committed art, but also as an art de vivre, a way of living. So rather than testifying about her political commitment, the architectural achievements, the photomontage, the creation of Charlotte Perriand, all this expresses an art which, for me, activates the possibilities of emancipation in life. So, given the title, I think that it's very important that in Charlotte Perriand's conception, art is not subject to politics. It is a form of layout that is both political and aesthetical. So art reflects a policy of the existence, but it's not a means serving to an end, serving an end. So I'm not going to remind you of the basic things you know about Charlotte. Charlotte joined the UAM, the Association of Revolutionary Writers, AER, and for her, the function of the architect must be part of a humanistic vision, i.e., the engaged artist should work for an art for all, works for emancipation, liberation of humankind. It accompanies social movement without oriented or directing it. There's no figure, no rallying around the notion of enlightened elite guiding the masses like what you can have in Lenin. In my eyes, the singularity of her commitment is dual. First of all, she was fiercely independent, like a free electron. She fought for all liberties, all freedoms. And secondly, she implemented a very singular and visionary alliance between, on the one hand, social emancipation, and on the hand, harmony with the other forms of the living. And I would like to dwell on this alliance, in other words, between social justice and environmental justice. We know that she was close to the Communist Party without necessarily being as dogmatic as they were. Very quickly, she realized that there was a totalitarian drift in the Russian Revolution. To tell you about the three photomontages that I wanted to talk about, I've asked the technical staff to give us images every minute. Here you have three giant photomontages. The Great Misery of Paris, you see here in 1936, in the context of the affair of domestic arts. Then we will see the photomontages created for the waiting group of the Agricultural Ministry in 1937 with Fernand Léger for the Ministry of Agriculture during the Paris International Exhibition. And I think that in the three giant creations, Charlotte Perriand sees photomontage as a weapon of fight, a weapon to fight the bourgeois system, like an art that can speak to the people. Because at her level, art makes it possible to act for equality, to leave oppression, women's oppression, oppression of workers, oppression of the poor, oppression of nature also. And I think that Charlotte's singularity is the fact that she called for a revolution that is both spiritual and political, internal and external. Sarah was telling us about this bare nature, and I think this is equivalent to this notion of inner revolution. I was going to tell you about the Great Misery of Paris. I think this is not what you're seeing. Regarding the Great Misery of Paris, this dates back to 1936. With art here is represented as a social transformation tool. You have a number of text, statistics, maps collected by Perriand and others. Here she has a graphic and textual element. She described the situation of Paris at the time. You see different earmarking, where you have both the diagnosis about the urban situation of Paris in 1936, and all this means that you may solve problems. So the work of art goes from what the situation is to what the situation could be. Here you see a lot of utopia, committed utopia. Art must implement a society based on justice and equality. You also have a proposal based on the notion of inner liberation, really alienated freedom, the fact of leaving voluntary slavery, to quote La Boétie. rather than a collection of objective data. This is going to invalidate one thing, the cliché of an apolitical urbanization. There's no apolitical architecture, there's no urbanization that is not political. And I think this is a stereotype that Charlotte Perriand is trying to destroy. As I said, the photomontage is a weapon to fight domination, but it is totally foreign to any dogmatic corpus. It is carried by the hope of the Front Populaire in 1936 in France, far from applying a Marxist grid to denounce misery and poor conditions of living in poor neighborhoods. Charlotte Perriand is going to open up all the discourses, ideologies by opening to humankind concretely and by not sticking to the new man of the Russian Revolution. So the photomontage wants to act on the spirits, awaken spirits through a dual semiology, because on the one hand you have words and images playing at the same time. On the photomontage, on the next photomontage, maybe we should insist also on this very important date of 1936. In those years, on the one hand, Charlotte already talks about the disaster of the environment. The fresco is going to talk about the poor conditions of living in France, the high mortality, childhood mortality rate in some areas, and she already talks about the terrible consequences of industrialization, the oppression of women, who is just limited to household work. And I think that the technical progress is already denounced, and we know that after the interest for technology, after the 1920s, where machines were thought to promote progress, after the arrival of a number of factors like the 1929 a crisis of confidence, skepticism about the promises of emancipation. So at the level of slogans, it's almost musical composition. A number of slogans condemn slavery of women, real estate speculation, destruction of gardens. That's why I like to say that Charlotte Perriand is a proto-whistleblower. She warns us about concrete, the invasion of concrete and the destruction of nature. For example, in one of the areas, you see that here you have a slogan on a landscape of concrete, and the sentence says a wall of stone is replacing a belt, where in 1936 and now in 2018 very few governments are aware of the disaster anticipated by Charlotte Perriand. So we see photomontage as a lever of action. In order to act on the present, to act on the future, you have to unveil the logic of the power that is at work in urbanization and the destruction of the countryside. Rightly or not, I have seen as an echo the work of Henri Lefebvre, situationist. To change life, you need to change the city. When you introduce concrete in the countryside, when you introduce concrete in the cities, you also introduce concrete in the minds. Since I might be too long, I'd like to shorten my presentation by saying the first point on which I had focused is the fact that the visionary power of Charlotte Perriand comes from the union between, the conjunction between two models. She wasn't a conceptual woman. She integrated this dual movement in her creation. The two visions she was able to reconcile is first the Marxist vision, anthropocentric vision, a history marked by a desire to control. And on the other hand, a more Oriental vision. We know the influence Japan has had on Charlotte and the influence of Charlotte on Japan's, an insertion of the subject in the whole. And here we can talk about the green, the environment, harmony between humans and non-humans, harmony that it respects the different elements. And I think that it is quite singular that the photomontage we have talked about all adopt those two patterns that seem to be different. First, this notion of mastery, a Marxist reading, the domination on event, and on the other hand, a symbiosis with nature. So when those two elements are separate from one another, I think that Charlotte Perriand has designed the power of their union. Let's say that where Marxist inspiration is used, man shapes the history and is shaped by history. That is the sentence of Marx in 18 Brumaire. There is in Charlotte Perriand this side. In The Great Misery of Paris, we see on one of the panels that is superimposed on an industrial landscape a text about the domination of nature that is going to allow an improvement in living conditions. So, what is specific is that without it being contrary, Charlotte Perriand is interested in emancipation. She is also very much interested in a nature that is almost fragile, a nature that is not eternal, that should be respected. I'd like to quote Laure Adler talking about her instinct as a libertarian, her love for nature. We know that Marxism said that the future of man is to enslave nature. And I think that here the break between Marxism and Charlotte Perriand, because she, in fact, is between those two paradigms, and we know that the Marxist paradigm, apart from André Gortz and others, the Marxist paradigm did not become very interested in nature. When you look at Badiou, for example, the protection of the environment remains like a blind spot or a gray area. I'd like now to talk about the two other photomontages, the one in the Agricultural Ministry.
So in 1936, and the one at the pavilion of the same ministry, where you can see huge pictures of peasants, men and women, numbers, maps, the agricultural France, but also the urban France, and a lot of imagination. And through statistics and diagrams, through the use of pictures of François Collages, taken from the working France, Charlotte Perriand shows two visions of the world on these murals in the waiting room. The side that has prevailed so far, backbreaking work in the fields, really hard realities for the farmers, and on the other side, with the rise of the Front Populaire, the promise of cooperative farms, modernizing rural spaces. So once again, there's this story, this narrative that confronts the darkness of the past and the promise of a better future for the popular and agricultural classes. And like we said this morning, it is thanks to her rural roots that Perriand really committed to this cause. So there is a relationship with nature, and her commitment for the agricultural measures defended by the Front Populaire really come from here. There is no taking this out of context. Unlike today's schizophrenic approach with experts speaking of the environment, but being completely removed from the material aspect of the environment. So this photo montage that was done in collaboration with Fernand Léger for this pavilion in 1937, it also plays on this bâtiment between them. There is a striking impact with the shapes and the colors and the text. And so the photo montage is used as a manifest. It is committed art. But it also goes hand in hand with a very realistic policy. In this photo montage, you can see many slogans from the Front Populaire limiting the length of the workday, paid vacation, worker rights, and once again, at a time where the government is trying to take away many social protections, I think these photo montages from Charlotte Perriand are more relevant than ever. So you can see this photo montage as a social weapon, a way to awaken consciences that in and of itself has a political potential. It works within a project of a fight to revive the political project, to transform this field. And that is why when I spoke of the Rimbaud poem about the boat, I think for Charlotte Perriand we could associate her work. You have to transform the world like Marx and dream like Rimbaud. So action and dream. I think it's in an interview of Pernet that I read, the power of dreaming for Charlotte Perriand in her creations. So I'm going to speed it up a little bit so that I don't monopolize the speaking time. So I would say I see Charlotte Perriand as a woman who's a precursor of ecological and environmental policies. And beyond photo montage, the fact that Charlotte Perriand had the ambition of making living spaces an analog, a mirror of the natural living space, the natural habitat. So at the social level, at the artist's level, she's one of the first people who've understood and really grasped how much the wonders of vegetable digital architecture, the intelligence of flowers, how much shape they've given to her work. And as a conclusion, I have a hypothesis that the magic, in the true sense of the term, of Charlotte's creations most likely comes from the fact that she is attuned into action, a performative aspect, but also the kingdom of dreams, which we sorely need. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to give the floor to Sarah Wilson immediately so that we can enjoy all of your speeches. I would just like to get back to some very interesting aspects. The relationship to Marx and the photo montages cannot be conceived of without thinking of the precursors in the 1920s, which were very popular with the lyrical stories about the five-year plans. And there is, of course, a shift between the first Marx denouncing oppressing nature through capitalism, the most sacred values drowned in the glacial water of selfish calculations. So it sounds ecological and environmental. And the industrialist mystique of the five-year plan. So Charlotte, Léger, and others in this movement, they are in this mystique of the five-year plan, but they still can see its limits, as you said. And I think that is a very interesting idea, the shift of the photo montage from the epic side that is much less constructivist and much less mechanical than it could have been in the Sovietic montages of the time. Well, thank you very much. A big thank you to Suzanne Paget and Gladys Fabre, who invited me here, and Jacques Barsac and Sébastien, who organized this exhibition with Sébastien Goldkap, who gave me a beautiful tour of the exhibition yesterday, let me take pictures, and really tailor my speech today. I'm not an expert on Charlotte Perriand, despite my deep knowledge of the era. Jean-Louis, of course, we cannot give a full context in 15 minutes, but with Michel Perrault, and I could not possibly cite all the wonderful people she has, but I will try to go fast. So I would like to begin with this beautiful installation by this beautiful and talented young man who's taking advantage of the room, but has an intrusion unexpectedly in his living room. It is a sort of praise to the progress of man. We are at this, I was going to say, at the shift, a crash, and the phrase I really love by Aragon, and we're talking here about the cities of 1919, showing the new electricity, the developments, the street signs. Do you paint your chains? How can you exit capitalism? Léger himself said that Washington is an abstract show. It's wonderful, but it is a disaster. So, of course, for France, after 1931, the catastrophe was here. And despite these moments of happiness and flourishing by Charlotte Perriand, and this is how we meet, because I also chose this image. For me, the misery of Paris is shows everything that is hidden in the life and exhibition of Charlotte Perriand, as you said, an alternative that persists. And you can see here the words suburbs and countryside. And you can also see strength, youth, and no future. So the utopic vision is to go beyond this current vision. So at this time, the Front Populaire Léger, who's ever present here, but not the three figures of young surrealist painters to celebrate the Front Populaire in 1936, turn away from this utopia with these voluptuous, sensuous women, with these gymnastics bodies behind them, with protesters. Of course, we get to the subject of photo collages, and of course, the impact of a photo collage in the 1928 exhibition in Cologne. The Russian collages show women athletic, thoughtful women, mothers participating in the revolution. In 1929, there is also a picture in Stuttgart, but I wanted to talk about the 1930 exhibition at the Hygiene Museum in Dresden. This is the second big exhibition where the USSR has a strong role, and the first one is in 1912, after an exhibition where 5 million people came to Dresden to see an exhibition on hygiene, much before World War I. So there is this underlying theme of illness, disease, and curing it through hygiene that runs through the narrative of Charlotte's work, including through her participation in this photo collage. There is also a contrast between this beautiful young man's body doing the long leap and the bodies of the children and old people and the people from the ghetto and the suburbs, the emaciated children, people suffering from syphilis. When you look at the mortality rate, you talk about tuberculosis, syphilis, and malnutrition. So this is the other narrative that goes hand in hand with this life that is not utopian, it's hygienist. I don't know if you think this is mean to say, to put the beautiful chair made by Charlotte, the reclining chair, the end of a long workday with these men in these sanatoriums that filled the continent at the beginning of the 20th century with their gymnastics garb. You can see here a postcard from Germany, and you can see what I mean. And it's the same for the Salon des Arts Ménagers. Let's not forget that the idea of building a stronger France was a strategy of the French government after losing the 1871 war with the Prussians. And I don't remember the name exactly, but a high-level government official was in charge of this, and the Charlotte Perriand's career is parallel to this with the developments of the Salon des Arts Ménagers, and you see that with the introduction of the refrigerator to make kitchens cleaner, not only more modern, but also fighting rot and making things more hygienic. So there is this context that is around this utopia and happiness themes. But let's get back to the misery of Paris. Charlotte Perriand was obviously not the first person or even the first woman that wanted to take photos of the industrial world. In 1934, we had a beautiful album from Jeannette Cru. But what interests me most, and that would have been interesting, is the book My Paris by Ilia Ernbourg, who's an emissary of Stalin and a very famous writer and appreciated in the milieu in Montparnasse. In her book, My Paris, it is a propaganda piece of work with really horrible images of the slums and the bums of Paris, and a few bourgeois having their high-end liquor at the terrace, and the Lissitzky influence as well. And of course, this was not created for the Parisian market, but this is someone who just before Charlotte, she made a foray into this. And in 1933, the operations of the International Communist Committee had to move from Berlin to Paris. So this is the realm of Willy Munzenberg, who at this time in Paris is really making an influence in the publishing houses and so on, as some of us know very well. So these are the adventures of Charlotte in the government housing projects and the precarious suburbs. And through this experience, she built her photo montages, and I would love to know more about their construction, with these colored letters that look like naive, childish art, with a very pure Sovietic art, with the slogans. And I'm trying to go fast because we've mentioned this before, but I wanted to show it. And the beautiful slogans that she came up with Léger for the booths at the 1937 Expo. All these Front Populaire slogans that you might be familiar with. And these young people in 1937, which really piqued Le Corbusier's interest. And in these diagrams, it's interesting to see utopia, youth, and especially youth, and the role of the Expo, and the tiny role of Siam, which I find funny. But this is the situation, and this goes against the malnourished children and this filth and soot, which go against everything she stands for, despite her adventure going almost to touching the filth. I still wanted to say that she is not the only influent woman, but many other famous women emerged at this time. Gertrude Tarot, whose role is very large. According to Robert Tapper, her partner, she died during the Spanish War, and she also deserves a lot of attention and tribute. As a young hero who died for France, and Agnès Albert, who died in 1936. At the time of La Marseillaise, of Jean Renoir was calling on the Parisian people to take part in the revolution. She wrote a book, the first Marxist study. Oh, I think I went too fast.
Where is it? Page 3. Voilà.
Okay, page 3, to honor him with the title of the book, David Painter, and wrote Marxist critiques. And this, he really places himself as a thorn in the intellectual world. And this is a sort of a pocket book that is trilingual and was published in 1940. She's a big resistance figure. She has experience of forced labor camps that was very difficult in Germany. And I wanted to give homage to Agnès. She's also a hero. Marie Curie
very famous Irène Curie, and then Irène Joliot-Curie, once she married Frédéric Joliot, and she had a Nobel Prize in 1935. And I'm very proud to see that she became one of those secretaries for the government of Léon Blum. Despite their delay compared to America, she will appear. Well, she will come back in the story later, but let's finish with the third big figure who also really appreciated Fernand Léger. It's Nadia Léger, Nadia Kodasiewicz, who's a Russian woman. She's up here, dressed very simply. She manages the atelier of Fernand Léger. She organizes everything, all the big murals that are painted with teams. The atelier, when he's away, she's one of the richest, among one of the richest capitalists of the United States. I have a soft spot for this woman who's kind of a monster because of the strength of her trajectory and her will. She was a student of Malevich, went through Poland to come to Fernand Léger. And when he did this beautiful portrait of the wife of Chesterfield, she made her auto-portrait, self-portrait, identically. And so this is her self-portrait for the Front Populaire, where she makes this velvet curtain into a flag. So she was very in tune with this, and also with the photo collages of Fernand Léger himself, who are exposed here with Le Corbusier's work. You can see them on the screen. And she even really took part in the painting of this. But it must have been her, because Fernand Léger did not do secretary work. But she must have hired these people, because Fernand Léger did not paint this. Nadia, for me, is the Emilia Kabakov and the Jean-Claude of Fernand Léger. And this is very important, and Laura, this is also very big in how women were artists. This is crucial in feminine liberation. You see these beautiful men, artists, working with the Front Populaire on the street, but it is Danielle Casanova, one of the organizers and the bigger inspirer of the Union of Young Girls in France, who encourage young girls, young women, young seamstresses to march on the streets for women's rights. We cannot skip her in this history. And despite the fact that there was an exhibition about 10 years ago, The Forgotten Women of Buchenwald, all the women who got out alive of Buchenwald became ministers in the post-war government. And of course, Danielle is the big non-forgotten woman of Auschwitz, who became a martyr symbol. Aragon spoke of the immortal Danielle. She it really evokes this danger of women's suffrage, because it scares people who vote like their husbands, or should vote communist. And of course, it's not always about young women. After the war, it was the union of women, French women. So this is the post-war era, and we had this big conference for women in 1948, where Nadia, as you see, she's doing it in the style of Léger, with her team for the exhibition of 1948. But Danielle also becomes an object for one of the most shocking paintings exhibited in the recently. Is the word of Daniel Casanova, made in the style of the realist socialist style. In the 1950s, Boris Stadlitsky. This was a thought that came to me when I was preparing this conference, because I know this painting very well. It's a propaganda instrument for the Communist Party against the European Defense Committee. It is done by the women. But one of the reasons why this movement was rejected is that it shows the misery, the filth, the malnutrition, everything that Fernand Léger, as a good communist, was able to circumvent with his beautiful constructors who are building the new future, that are encouraged by these gorgeous poems about blue eyes and strong men. So all of the things that were set aside just as Stalin died. And to get back to Irène Joliot-Curie, in 1948, with her husband, she starts the Zoé, which is a sort of atomic nuclear reactor, the first one in France. And Joliot-Curie, who is a good communist, one of the first signatories of the Stockholm call against the nuclear bomb. We discovered the atomic reactor, and all of a sudden American money is more than welcome to rebuild France. The Marshall Plan. So this is not shocking that he was personally humiliated about this. Joliot-Curie, I'm sorry, I forget. He was chased out by he was ousted from his position. When you see this very famous image, the portrait of Stalin, it is Joliot-Curie speaking up here. Stalin, the Marxism or silence. You can easily imagine that he would not have accepted this giant column, given his trajectory. So Nadia Léger, she has some horrible paintings to the glory of Stalin, even after his death. But let's not forget that this was only 6 years before the incredible homage that she gave by building the Biological Museum of Fernand Léger in competition with Picasso. And I will conclude on a plane crash. I did not really expect this until I saw it yesterday. It is amazing that Nadia, after all of these sabotage stories, the Soviet concord by the French, Nadia makes works for Pierre Cardin, supremacist works, while working on the Aerofleet. But our hero of the day, Charlotte, did some beautiful things for Air France in Tokyo. For over 10 years in the 60s. So this is not a competition of longevity, because Charlotte will win that hands down. It is in the 90s when I saw her Summer Pavilion, when once I am in my little wheelchair, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. And bravo to France and bravo to Charlotte Perriand, because she is the winner of the spiritual beauty contest.
Thank you, Sarah. A very moving intervention, because my mother was Daniel Casanova in Auschwitz. So she's somewhere on the work you talked about after the war. She worked with Curie in the CIA, and she was ousted from CIA with him in a period we're not really aware of all the French McCarthyism, i.e. anti-left repression against Henri Lefebvre, who was blocked in his career. So there was a French version of McCarthyism between 49 and 53 with Mendes France. Nobody died on the electrical chair, but it was a very violent movement with workers, with the repression of miners. That is not over, despite what Macron. So there's this black period which explains this kind of reference to Stalin. I think it's an interesting period in the sequencing of periods. Another important thing, the allusion to the stone belt Véronique talked about. Le Corbusier was talking about 33 kilometers of shame around Paris. The housing built around Paris, it's a project that is a century old, and it is the biggest building project in Paris to this day. About 45,000 housing units built in 20 years by unknown architects, which are the most productive of Paris history. One question, if I had a flat in those buildings, I'd be happy. At the beginning, when they were built, people were delighted to have those flats. They were quite good housing units with insidious social segregation. In the East, only low social housing. In the West, no social housing. And in between, the buildings far from the subway for the poor, the buildings close to the metro for middle class, a lot of people, professors, teachers living there. What is striking is that this is being criticized by the left. Yes, it was totally rented. No, they were never praised. Never praised. No, I don't think so. Yes, in between the two wars, the city hall did praise them, but everybody denounced them. José Luis Sartre, in his book of 42, when he says that those units are an example of modern stacking of people, modern piling up of people in those flats. So Cynthia will have the last word. Well, first, I'd like to thank you for this invitation, and I'm going also to go back to the first roundtable. Two things. I'm not at all a specialist of Charlotte Perriand, a political and moral philosopher. We have implemented this year, last year in the French CNAM, in the Sainte-Anne Hospital, a large research seminar about called Design with Care. We have had Jacques Barzac come and open this major session. I want to recall that, and we consider Perriand as an horizon, a very considerable horizon in this continuum of care to the human being, care of the human being. We produce objects with her inspiration. Were really heirs of Perriand and also heirs of Adorno, the critical theory, psychodynamics. Perriand was also talked about in the area of politics, care, democracy. I also want to say how much I am attached to her. I have discovered Perriand thanks to Pernet. Perriand, Barzac, with their absolute sum. And I want to tell them that this restoration of Perriand's memory is decisive, and thank you for that, because it's on the basis of those images that we build. Very quickly, because time is flying, I'd like to start first with the question of style, and then the question of engagement dedicated to nature, even though it wasn't formalized at the times, but thanks to the possibility we have, we can decide that Perriand is the symbol of this alliance between world and nature. The first criteria of architecture for Perriand is biological. A biological architecture. The sun is essential for health, sound comfort, ventilation must be ensured. The cold and the warm should be controlled. There's this fundamental alliance with the elements. It is on the basis of this understanding of elements. How do you manufacture objects that support the world, objects that support us? The first allies of this Perriand architecture is light, the views, the void, the vacuum, the play with the volumes, a human architecture that is there to designate a milieu de vie. Whether she likes it or not, she's a designer. She's there to design forms of lives, usages of the world, a way of architecturing the world, of inventing that framework of living for the achievement. An architecture at the service of elements. All of her life she'll do that. She has a connection, a very interesting link between Japan and Savoie, the Savoie department. Once again, this style that is probably inhabited with everything she received as a child. There is a great maternal link when she says that until 3 she was full of light, affection. I gained the love of nature. I want to respect all farmers in the world. And today, when I think of La Tour or that's one of her texts. When we're reaching this stage of deterioration, this need of an anchoring, it's not something that is setting us, but something that brings us back to the world, to the fact of being able to live this world. The love for nature, for light, this experience of nature. She embodies the experiences of nature, environmental justice, that is very much linked to social justice, environmental ethics, a link to the living. There's something about man, humankind, that is exceptional, that is responsible. It's not a question of saying that it's all powerful. Perriand's architecture are fluid lines. You see that the very simple nature of life you see in what she does. It's wonderful to see this alliance, the absolute style of an architect and designer. Life is there. This is what we perceive in terms of alliance. And there's also what she's going to do very simply. What is the basic equipment you need in a house? Well, you need places to put away your stuff. You need to build something with a vacuum. But she also talks about the fact that it's going to be possible to gain time. That is a permanent fight. There's no useless object. There are objects that support our environment, that help us build our emancipation, that help us save time. They're allowing us to find more time to think, to be involved. There are also what she calls utilitarian walls, the point of separation, but that is something that supports something that is different from simple separation. So, the layout of the world, the layout of the void, this idea of creating a framework of life, an ambiance, to be looking for those emerging qualities of the place. We don't know what is going to emerge in a place. And you need to be able to promote a soul, welfare, well-being, inspiration. It is not something we're trying to produce. Here and there, we are posing points. And it's true that she has objects that makes it possible to do everything. The Rio bench, for example, you can do a lot of things with. You can just contemplate the word. And she says that the architect's task is to create an equipment that will be as subtle and sensitive as the human body. It's true that ergonomics is wonderful in Charlotte Perriand. So much about her style, her minimalist style. Then there's a second point about this responsibility, this duty to protect the environment. We've talked about it in the first round table. We've talked about her commitment that goes through discourses, the words. Here there's no discourse. I've just based myself once again on the objects. This desire to draw useful forms and shapes with a cost, a popular budget, the fact of always having a strong ownership, a design that is at the service of human sensitivity, a design that is really trying to protect humanism, regardless of the qualities. You have to have the possibility for renewal, unexpected qualities. We really have to remain like a flower. Let's make sure we will always have room for new objects and renewed objects. And in all of our objects, there's this modern and traditional idea of modularity that invents itself. There's also something that inspires me a lot, this trace of the living in her work. She likes to protect the living with soft trunks, pebbles. When she started drawing shells, butterflies, giraffes, all of this universe that reminds us of the simplicity of life that is decisive. One last point. In order not to take up too much of your time, something that is a form of echo with Arendt, and what Arendt says specifically about the stabilizing function of human life regarding objects, durable objects. That is almost a political fight when we talk about manifest obsolescence, this production of objects, falsification of innovation. So here you have objects that are dedicated to life, to the respect of the living, without exaggeration, just the fact of being there. And also, I'm not so much here talking about Arendt, but more about Gunther Anders, which is not too far. He was her husband for a few years, and Gunther talked about this negative pride of objects. This is what we said. Charlotte has created objects in a world that transformed objects in order for them not to say what they are. And especially dangerous objects that, in fact, looked like nothing and which were without any principles of honesty. In Perriand, there's an absolute principle of honesty. You don't need to look for uses for gloves, for example. You can see it. But nuclear reactors do not show anything. They look, in fact, insignificant. They do not reveal anything about their threat, but they are threatening. In Perriand, you have the contrary, objects that are just dedicated to an honest life. They have no pride, they have no negative pride, and they just come and create confidence, the confidence we absolutely need, for me, for all of us. In the chair Humanities and Health, this inspiration is there, not in fact forget about the basic function of objects at the service of the desire to protect the world. Thank you. I think that we have to conclude. We won't have time for a dialogue. One word I'd like to start with Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, who was a very nice girl, Charlotte Perriand, who was a very different kind of a girl. What I like about you said, Cynthia, is the relationship with Hannah Arendt on the objects that stabilize the world. In fact, Charlotte Perriand are not are objects that help you have order and not disorder. Thanks to all.